My pleasure to introduce our online presenter, Angelina Blair, who's going to be talking to us about children's lit. I'd also like to give a special shout out and thank you to you for presenting all the way from Kent State. So very happy to have you here for DERAIL, and without further ado, we'll leave it off to you.
Guys,
There we go.
hello?
Hi, we
Hello,
got
we
you.
got you. All right.
Can you hear us? Oh no, you can't. It's not
Hello?
on.
Hi, guys.
Feedback going on.
Hello.
Can't hear you.
How's that, Angelina?
Hi, my sound's going in and out.
Okay, I think I'll turn us off so we don't hear the feedback, okay? But we can hear you.
Okay, great. I'm sorry, I didn't know if you could hear me or not. I can't hear you.
That's all right, we can hear you. Sounds
Yeah,
great.
you're fine.
Thank you.
All right, here we go. Sorry about that. Okay, I started this project in 2016. Dr. Michelle Martin came to the Schubert Center at Case Western Reserve to do a talk on African American, the genre of children's literature, the genre of resistance. And she talked about the historical trail of the subject area. And I basically thought this would be a great topic. So I started looking at other collections and scholars. I looked at Cleveland Public Library Special Collection, Kent State University Special Collection, Ohio Link, and a few other library systems. And I started analyzing the content in different children's books from colonial times to contemporary times. I looked at literary history. I also looked at publishing statistics. And what I found very interesting was Nancy Lyric did a 1965 survey on the lack of diversity in children's literature. And what I found really striking was that according to a survey done in 2013 by the Cooperative Children's Book Center and a 16 or 15 study, I can't remember the date specifically, it's 2015, Mean Little Book Survey, they did 2 census surveys, I think they were 2015, 2013, that there is still this lack of diversity in the publishing field, and I found that very striking. It feels like we're taking a step back, and I feel that we need to have more books published for this lack of diversity. Now, the next thing that I looked at the genre of resistance, and I looked at research done by various scholars about how children recognize their own ethnicity and how they rely heavily on illustrations and decoding the meaning. Another very interesting thing is I found that multicultural education is playing an important role. I found this through studies. I worked in a public school system with primarily African American children, and I did after school care programming, and it's for 3 years. And I found that many of my colleagues and I have found that a lot of the multicultural education and bringing in multicultural international literature for the children definitely brought some positives with their test scores and their knowledge of the understanding the world and learning about diverse voices. I also found it interesting how literacy is enhanced for children of color when there are culturally relevant stories. What I found really interesting, some of the children at my work, when I worked in the after-school care program, said, these books have nothing to do with me. These are, these characters don't relate to me. They're not, African American. And I found that very striking. I had a lot of students say that to me. And when we did read books to the children that were multicultural African American characters, they seemed to relate more to the stories. Another thing, I looked at the historical analysis of African American picture books. I looked at Marion Martin's book, Brown Gold. I also looked at a timeline that I found through a multicultural literature book. I can't remember the source, but I could do a little digging on that and send that. What I found really interesting is there was a lot of This is an example. I'm sorry, let me go back. This is an example of a book that had a negative stereotypical representation of African Americans. This is The Little Black Sambo. And The Story of the Inky Boys was another book that followed the same character from the Sambo. Another very interesting thing that I found was that in the 1980s, and these were going on to the 1950s, and even to the 1980s and 1990s, I found books that had stereotypical depictions of African Americans within them with the Black Sambo. Ezra Keith's book, The Snowy Day, was the first book to break the ground with multicultural literature because it actually had a positive, everyday setting with a African American boy, even though it was written by a white author. I found this very intriguing. And this brought about the start of the golden age of African American picture books. And this book inspired and ushered in the founding of the Council of Interracial Books for Children. In the 1960s and 70s, with the end of segregation, Black authors focused on African American people, normalizing life experiences, African heritage, and gender stereotypes. So these are a couple of examples of books that have won numerous awards and honors. And this is when African American literature was starting to get a notice, attention by libraries, teachers, and various publishers. It's very intriguing. And then in the 1990s, African American literature was going through a phase of realistic depictions, looking at the painful realities of the Black experience. Brown Like Me is about a little boy who's adopted. Everett Anderson's Goodbye is about a boy whose father is died and he's grieving. Smoky Night is about some of the, riots, and Whitewash is about gang violence. And then in the 2000s, Black authors were moving away from writing for a Black audience towards a more general audience while celebrating Blackness. These are examples of how Black authors are resisting white superiority in children's picture books, and examples that celebrate the diversity of Black people. In 2016, children's literacy forever was changed when 3 of the Fort Caldecott and Newberry and 1 of the Newberry Honors were by authors of color and by people of color, with the exception of the Hickey's Waiting, which was written by a white author. The Trombone Shorty was written by an African-American writer, whereas Last Step in Market Street was illustrated by an African-American, and Fannie Lou Hammer was authored as well by African-American. And you can see that there's this these multiple words in these books. That's another interesting thing. And then in 2017, the children's liturgy was again changed. More African-American award winners. And these are some of the examples of books that have won for this year. I found that very intriguing, how the authors were, again, in the spotlight for the Black experience. These are books that I looked at for positive depictions of African Americans. Last Stop in Market Street and Sunday Shopping talks about the relationship between a grandma and her grandchild, whereas Knock Knock and Visiting Day are looking at the relationships with the topic of incarceration. The little boy in Knock Knock, his father goes to jail, and the little girl in Visiting Day, her mother goes to jail. Or her father goes to jail, I'm sorry. And very few books are published on the topic of incarceration, and incarceration is a big topic these days with a large amount of population of African Americans that are incarcerated. And another interesting thing about these books is that they give a positive, realistic depiction of life for African Americans that doesn't focus on slavery or Black history, which a lot of the scholars have agreed that that's a fascinating shift. There's a study done by Yoon, and Yoon talks about this in her study. And again, this is some examples of the relationships between the grandma, grandson, the grandchildren, and the 2 books that I mentioned, Sunday Shopping and Last Stop. This is another look at the positive relationships between the grandmother and her grandchild visiting her father in prison. And this is a picture in Knock Knock of the son who's sad about his father being in jail and his kind of this realistic portrayal of relationships. Teaching African American picture books is important. It speaks to all audiences. It doesn't just speak to African American culture. It also has key value for children of races and backgrounds. And it teaches the importance of diversity and normalizes the positive depictions of Black characters and prepares Black children for adulthood. And also another study by the Southern Poverty Center says it teaches tolerance, which I found very interesting. These are examples of some books used to teach positive. When I mentioned the negative caricatures earlier with the Black Sambo, the story of Little Beth Badgie and Sam and the Tigers are positive depictions. You could use these as teaching tools to compare to the story of the Black Sambo, which is a very negative portrayal of African Americans. These are some controversies that were current with the birthday cake for George Washington and a fine dessert with the depiction of smiling slaves. Both books were pulled from the shelves. These are some illustrations of the smiling slaves that give you an idea of the controversy behind the books. And here's another, okay, another set of illustrations. Okay, now, with looking at the, comparing the photographs of slaves, actual photographs to the illustrations, like I mentioned with the Black Sambo, this could be an excellent teaching tool for children. I understand the point of pulling the items from the shelf, but also I think they can make great teaching tools to do comparison and contrasts with what the realism is compared to their idealized what the smiling slaves. And here's another example. There's some slaves in a cotton field. You can tell they're not happy looking compared to the pictures in the illustration from the fine dessert. I think that it would be a great teaching tool. By selecting culturally accurate, young readers can understand the contributions that African Americans have made through society throughout history. I think that's what's most important. These are examples of negative popular culture, advertising and media that depict racist images. From these controversies, we still have work to go in society. We need to look more at the negatives and try and have them rooted out. The examples elaborate how work still needs to be done to change the past negative stereotypes, which is still carried on in our popular mainstream culture. Finally, African American illustrators and authors like Don Tate, Jerry Pinkney, and Christian Robinson are educating the public about their picture books that depict positive images of African American children in everyday studies. And I actually attended these events, except for the one at the West Chapel Hill Library. He was at the Cleveland Public Library, and he did a presentation, Mr. Tate. And he's actually a Virginia Hamilton winner for this year. He'll be coming to Kent State to do a presentation. But I find that these presentations educate the public on the negatives of caricature and how we can take those negatives and make them a teaching tool. And then this is Jerry Pinkney talking at the Cleveland County Library. I'll do a quick, if I can get the video to work, quick snippet. My apologies if I'm having technical problems getting this to load. Okay, that was an example of a talk. Okay, and this is the last thing. Is enough being done today? Are enough cultural, accurate books for children being published? Will this trend continue? Those are some of the questions we need to ask ourselves, because today's published children's literature continues to seldom depict characters of color and will not be ready for the future U.S. Census projected Bureau of 2060 major minority population boom. A 2013 study by Lee and Lowe found that of 393 books published about people of color, 57% were created by people of color. Due to the lack of publishing diverse children's literature, it is difficult for bookstores, libraries, and schools to have diverse books available. Books play a critical role in the healthy physical, cognitive, emotional, and social development as milestones for children. Without the availability of diverse literature which transforms the reading process, children will lack insight into themselves, their cultural settings, and being able to learn from the perspective of others. Children of any background can learn about the value of a good book and that diverse literature is not only for people of color. In view of the fact that a lack of diversity still is present in publishing houses and literature, work still has to be done to change the past negative stereotypes of African Americans in children's literature, which is still carried today in today's popular culture. Thank you. These are my references. Sorry, I'm going this quickly.
Does anybody have questions
Any
on
questions?
this presentation? Can we communicate with her via chat?
I don't know if she's been looking at chat right now. I have tried a few times. But let me try the volume one more time. Apologies for the feedback.
Yeah,
to
I mean,
hear
we'll
it.
just have to like. mute
Any questions?
And
Does anybody have questions
switch
for
back
our
to
One second,
presenter,
we're having a
Angelina?
little bit of trouble with feedback, but we're trying.
It's okay. I'm having trouble too.
We're gonna try and mute something on our thing.
yeah, so we're just gonna have to like take turns.
Okay.
How's that?
Does
Can you
anybody
hear
have
us?
questions about this presentation or any feedback, thoughts, future directions for this?
Yeah, that's a good question right there. Is she planning on doing any further research?
So Angelina, just so you know, we don't hear you right now. We're gonna alternate back and forth. So we're gonna ask you the question and then switch back to you.
Somebody have, yes.
Future directions. Can she hear?
Say, you can take this.
Yo. Is this what?
It just takes a second.
Okay, so Angelina, can you hear me?
She can't answer us?
Because we have the, okay, so we have the.
Okay, so yeah, she can't hear us. Maybe try now.
Justin,
Can you hear us now? Thumbs up or down?
how about the chat?
What about the chat?
Yeah, thumbs up if you can hear us. Or can you look in the chat box? Okay, she can hear us.
She can hear us. Okay.
Okay, Angelina. So, great presentation. So my question is, do you plan on doing any further research on this topic? Or are there any directions you plan on taking in the future related to this research?
Okay, so now mute whatever.
I can't hear you.
Okay, yeah, if you didn't hear that, will there be any future directions and what is your future research in this area?
Okay, my future research in this area?
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
Yes.
Correct.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'd like to look more at the, I'd like to do a survey on the book, do a survey on a collection maybe, on the depictions of the positive. I'd like to see how many books come now, because the Yoon's study was done in 2000, let's see here, when was Yoon's study done? Hold on a second. Her study was done in, her study is outdated, that's what I'll say. But I'd like to do a little bit more on her study and maybe do a content analysis and look at the subjects, or the settings, I'm sorry. Because there are a lot of books that are published that I looked at in my sample mostly focused on slavery and African American history. I'd like to see more on just the positive realistic settings. there's a collection at Kent State University called the Morantz and Reinberger collection. I'd like to actually use their collection and do an analysis of that in the future.
Anybody else have
Can you
questions?
hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you. We're gonna ask the room
Okay,
member
great.
questions and get back to you in one moment. Okay, any other questions?
Thank you so much, Angelina.
Thank you. Angelina also said that she has the video
I
and
can't
she
hear
will
you.
post it. Yep. I'm just letting the room know about the video. Thanks, Angelina.
Hold on, I'm grabbing it.